If you've always wondered what would happen if Tony Montana's tiger in Scarface got a hold of all of his cocaine, folks, do I have a film for you? Howdy, I'm Jeff Goldsmith, and this is the Q&A. My agenda is simple. Each week, I plan to bring you in-depth insights into the creative process of storytelling. And folks, it's not a tiger, it's a bear. It's Cocaine Bear, as a matter of fact, not to be confused with any other bear like Hashish Bear or Mushrooms Bear, which I would think exists quite a lot because mushrooms grow pretty naturally. But I digress. Today, we have Cocaine Bear in the podcast in all of its glory with the screenwriter Jimmy Warden as our guest. And you know what? This was a fun episode. The film is a lot of fun. It is very silly. It's in theaters now. It's going to be on streaming and renting pretty soon from what I hear. So you should be able to rent it too. But this one is definitely worth masking up and going to see because it is quite funny and should be seen with a crowd without a doubt. And of course, it is also good news that Jimmy was very forthcoming with his creative process and the very fast track to production that Cocaine Bear had. So I know you'll dig this episode. And speaking of things to dig, I hope you check out today's sponsor, screencraft.org. You know, breaking into Hollywood could be a confusing, convoluted business. Fortunately, Screencraft helps writers with both the craft and the business of Hollywood. Screencraft.org has everything for your journey, from video lectures with your favorite writers like Tony Gilroy and J.J. Abrams to hands-on career coaching with their writer development team. Screencraft also has some of the best genre-specific screenwriting competitions, with judges ranging from Oscar-winning screenwriters to top literary agents and managers. Hundreds of past winners and finalists have started their careers with the direct support of Screencraft by writing films for and being staffed on TV shows over at Netflix, Amazon, Hulu, Universal, Lionsgate, Blumhouse, ABC, and more. So if you're an aspiring writer, don't think twice about checking out screencraft.org. And of course, while you're surfing around online, I hope you also check out Backstory Magazine over at backstory.net. Our Oscar issue is out by the time that you have heard this, so I hope you check it out there too. It is our 10th Oscar issue, in fact, and is going to be packed with a lot of great stuff that I know that you will enjoy. You could see the table of contents over at backstory.net. If you've never read us before, you could test drive us by reading our free issue in the Backstory app or over at backstory.net on a desktop or laptop. So there is a lot to explore. And look, folks, it would really mean a lot to me if my podcast listeners and iTunes and Spotify and my YouTube watchers of the Backstory Magazine YouTube page, which is where you could see these interviews happen as Zoom interviews. It would really mean a lot to me if you consider supporting my passion project. So thanks for considering becoming a subscriber. But now, without any further ado, let's jump right into our interview with screenwriter Jimmy Warden about his latest film, Cocaine Bear. So look, I want to give our listeners a baseline for you. From whence dost thou hail? Where are you from? And did you study writing or filmmaking in college?
I grew up in Chicago.
Whereabouts?
I was kind of in Lincoln Park.
Okay. I mean, I only mention this occasionally because I am so elated that Gino's East Pizza opened in Los Angeles, which is a Chicago pizza chain, and I freaking love it. I love that they opened in LA.
I know. I still haven't gone yet. I have to go.
Wow.
I'm a big deep dish fan, though.
I should end this Zoom right now. But okay, I'll keep going.
I'm going to go. I've been in Chicago, of course.
Well, yeah. So you grew up in Chicago, and then where'd you go to school? Did you study filmmaking in school?
No, I mean, I sort of did. I had more of a general studies major in college, but I took a bunch of film classes that were more like film criticism, where we would have 2 nights a week from 7 to 10. They would play weird movies and we'd have to write about them. You know, I worked as a writer on sort of like our local access TV show at Indiana University. So always had like an interest in it. I was always really into movies. I moved out to LA and had to get jobs and work my way up in order to have the confidence to quit those jobs and move out on my own and write screenplays.
Let's talk about that for a second, because one of them is kind of interesting, in which you were a PA for Lord Miller when they were making 21 Jump Street. And so what was that experience like for you, being a PA on one of their films?
I got that job and went down to New Orleans, and I crashed on a family friend's couch for a couple months. And then I was that annoying PA that didn't do his job and didn't lock up any locations and was just trying to pawn scripts off to people at craft services. But,
Is that true? Like, were you really handing scripts out to people?
I was pitching ideas.
Okay.
I didn't really know anything at the time.
Because most PAs would get fired for that.
No, yeah, for sure. I probably should have been fired. But yeah, I mean, Phil and Chris were just so delightful and kind to me on that movie. And then we ran into each other many times in between Cocaine Bear and 21 Jump Street. And, they always remembered my name at various premieres or industry events and stuff like that. They're just the best. That was their first live action movie. And watching them was definitely like an inspiration to me, because I was like, oh, I definitely want to do this. I don't necessarily want to be a PA my entire life, but it's definitely the career that I wanted to pursue in terms of creating and making movies.
Well, I would be remiss going forward into your first produced credit, The Babysitter, Killer Queen on Netflix in 2020. But like, I'm curious, before this movie, it seems like there's a connection here that we got to call out. Good old Brian Duffield, because he was a producer on Killer Queen and he was a writer on the first Killer Queen. And he's also a producer on Cocaine Bear. Tell us about your connection with him. For podcast listeners, you would recognize Brian as a friend of the podcast. He did Spontaneous, and we did a podcast with him together for that, which was his directorial debut. And so tell us about that connection.
Yeah, I mean, I actually remember him on this podcast because I've listened for a very long time.
Okay, good.
But I remember him a couple years ago talking to you when Spontaneous was coming out. And I think he mentioned Cocaine Bear at some point.
I think he did too.
So we met because I worked for McG. I was his assistant for years and years. We were kind of just flying around the world shooting movies and pilots and stuff like that. And McG directed Babysitter, and Brian and I got to know each other through that. And then Brian, through some connections, sort of introduced me to my manager, and he's always been my first reads, and I was just starting out really writing and taking it seriously while I was still working as an assistant. And Brian was reading scripts of mine, half-hour pilots and stuff. He was very kind at the time. Yeah, and he set me up with my manager. Then, the second one comes along and we collaborated on that and had a blast. And I can't say on air that he's a mentor, but I mean, he kind of is, because his head will get too big.
I mean, he already has.
But yeah,
he's worse.
Gigantic. But yeah, he's my first read. And that's what happened with Cocaine Bear. And usually I'm sending him ideas as well. It's like, this is what I'm writing next, or what do you think of this story? Like, what do you think of that? And he's kind of a good litmus test. If he says it's stupid, then it probably is stupid. And if he laughs and says that it's stupid, it's something that I could probably pursue.
Well, so you pitched him Cocaine Bear in like an early iteration, basically, like just as a pitch.
I sent him like a screenshot in early 2019 when I came across the story. And he was like, this is great. You should do this. We still do just joke about it because neither of us can really believe that the movie got made. But it's been kind of endless fodder for us to talk about on our, group chat.
I was talking to my mom, who's 76, about it. I had her watch the trailer. She hates violence and gore in movies, and she'd consider seeing it. She thought the trailer was funny, and she would consider seeing it. And she's 76.
My parents loved it. They went to the premiere last night, and they really liked the movie. I mean, I think they had to tell me that, but I could tell usually when they're lying. But they loved it, so maybe your mom will too.
I think she will. Well, so how about this? Before we get fully into Cocaine Bear, is there anything else you want to tell us about in kind of those breaking in years when you were writing and you had a manager? Did you have some unproduced screenplays that sold that kind of were, either slowly moving forward or trapped in development hell? Or was really Killer Queen, The Babysitter, like, was that really your first big gig and there wasn't as much before it?
No, yeah. I mean, right after I did some PA work right after school, and then I moved out to LA, and I was like, all right, I have to break in somehow. So I got a job in a mailroom at a talent agency.
Oh, which one?
And then at Gersh.
Okay.
I was an assistant there for, far too long, but I had a great experience and I made good friends who I still talk to today. Then they helped me get a job working at Wonderland, which is McGee's company. And I was writing at the time. So I was kind of writing nights and weekends anytime I could kind of free up some space during the day, like lunch breaks and that kind of stuff while I was working at this production company. I set up a couple things like a half-hour pilot, and I sold, a pitch to a studio and that kind of stuff. So I was working as a screenwriter while still doing my assistant gig.
What was the half-hour pilot? Like, do you want to tell us about what the titles or names of any of these projects were in case any of them still go forward?
I don't know if they ever will. The half-hour pilot was something called The Alternate. This is like 2015, before the multiverse became very popular. And the idea was established businessman switched universes with like the worst version of himself. So it's like a weird body swap movie, or it's like a reality swap movie or TV show for that matter. That got me some good meetings and stuff. And I was doing, various water bottle tours. That stuff started heating up. And I was also doing punch-ups on some of McGee's scripts and that kind of stuff. So I was working, and I had some really good experience on set from doing that job. And then eventually I had sold enough where I was like, okay, I can actually make the jump. So I left that job and I, started screenwriting full time.
That's awesome. Well, all right, we're going to jump into Cocaine Bear. So here's what we know. In December 1985, a former cop and convicted drug smuggler, Andrew C. Thompson, overloaded his plane with too much cocaine and whatnot, and he jumped out and died due to a faulty parachute. A bear eventually was found in Georgia that had gone through 40 bags of cocaine and had died from ingesting it. And allegedly, and I don't know if this is true or not, you could fill in the blank if you know this, the bear itself is now on display over one state in Kentucky at the Kentucky Fun Mall, and they named the display Cocaine Bear. And so is any of that true? And where did you stumble upon the article?
So that is definitely a topic of debate, whether it's the actual bear. I don't think that's the actual bear on display in Kentucky, but that bear that is on display is how I came across the story. The true story, like the facts that you just gave us, that actually happened. Like Andrew Carter Thornton dropped many kilos of cocaine into the woods in Chattahoochee, and a bear got into it and was found months later next to empty bags of cocaine. And it turns out that the bear had eaten it all. That's the true story. And that's kind of what I found out after I had looked at like a picture of two tourists posing in like a selfie next to Pablo Escobar, which was on like the placard in that museum. And I was like, who the hell is Pablo Escobar?
That's amazing.
So then I kind of clicked on that link, and then it took me to the story of Andrew Carter Thornton, and that's how that all came about. And then there's a rumor that Waylon Jennings, who I'm a gigantic fan of, the country singer, bought the bear and stuffed it. And then I think that museum said that they wanted an auction or something like that. But all that's up for debate now. I don't know if that's the real bear.
So there could be many fake cocaine bears floating around in the markets. That's what the warning is.
And I guess for all we know, and I like it better that it's not the real bear, because for all we know, the bear survived, and went on a murderous rampage.
I mean, your movie's really a documentary, so I don't have documentaries in my series that often, but I'm glad to have you. And by the way, thanks for listening to the podcast. You mentioned that earlier. This means that you're the 36th person that went from podcast listener to being in the podcast.
I mean, podcasts are such helpful tools, I think, especially for aspiring screenwriters and also working screenwriters, because it gives you kind of an insight into the different ways and the different paths to which people got to where they are. There's never a science to it. There's no formula. So listening to all of your guests over the years has been definitely valuable for me.
No, thanks, man. And that's what I love about it as well, in which they prove, like the guests prove, that there is no one way to do it. And so I think like for writers in their darkest moments, when they're like, oh, I'm not doing this that supposedly you're supposed to do, the truth is, find your own way to tell the story. And like everybody's just sharing the way that they found to tell their story, which is cool. And speaking of which, that leads right into your habit. Tell us about your habit. When you sit down, how important is outlining to you versus just writing? And tell us about your original document for Cocaine Bear.
There was no original document for Cocaine Bear. It varies, I mean, you can't really sell a pitch, for instance, without having the full thing thought out. in advance because you have to get people to buy into the idea. For this, it actually is lucky because, I never thought that anybody was going to make Cocaine Bear. I thought that maybe it would be a good sales tool or get me into some rooms, or assistants would pick it up because it's a buzzy title. And I knew that, and working as like a junior executive at a production company, I kind of knew what would make me open up a script or a PDF. At a certain point, I had my launching off point for Cocaine Bear, and then I just let my imagination sort of run wild. So I didn't outline it at all. I kind of let the idea gestate for a little while before I write, and I do that a lot. Even if I sell a pitch, I want to take like a month or two and watch movies or listen to music or really just kind of plot the story out in my head. But I don't have treatment documents or outlines or anything like that. I don't even do bullet points.
Well, so was this sold as a pitch, or did you write it on spec and then you were taking around the script?
No, I wrote it on spec.
Smart.
Yeah. It was lucky because if I had sold it as a pitch, I think that maybe I wouldn't have been able to take as many chances in writing it as I did. Agree. It's a tough sell, and we do weird things. Like, I don't know how to pitch a studio or a production company that two kids are going to do cocaine in the woods, like in the middle of the movie. You just can't pitch that. So at a certain point, I was like, it's execution dependent. I know that it's a good idea, right? I know it's a great title and it's a splashy story inspired by true events, but you have to surprise people as well, while also giving them what they want.
Well, so, okay, you don't outline. So then when you sat down to write, did you give yourself a page count to hit each day or a certain amount of hours that you wanted to write?
No, I usually wake up at 6:30 or 7 because I like to write in the morning before the phone starts and, my wife gets up and all that kind of stuff. So I like the quiet for sure. I write better in the morning. I don't have like the benchmarks that a lot of people do, or 5 pages a day or anything like that. It's usually a race to 90 for me. Get to 90 pages, spit it out. Don't think too much about it, and then go back and rewrite yourself. That's what I do.
That's actually a good benchmark, because how long then did it take you to get to your first 90?
For Cocaine Bear, it took probably about a month and a half, 2 months maybe, to get to 90. I always revise while I write as well. I'm not just free flying on the keys and, typing whatever comes up in my head to try to get to 90 pages. Like, sometimes something will come up in Act 2 where I'm like, oh, I should set that up in Act 1. So I'll go back and I'll write that scene in Act 1. And that's kind of the way I've been doing it ever since I started.
Okay, well, so since you don't outline, since you don't have any original design document when you start, did you know that you were going to end up writing an ensemble?
Yeah. Okay. So that's part of like the gestation period, I guess, for me, where I had an influence in mind for this movie, which is usually how I start out when writing a movie. I'm like, what does this want to be like? I think just in terms of structure, not thinking about tone, not thinking about characters or anything like that. And the structure that I've always loved, and I thought was perfect for this movie, because you have the ideal setting of a national forest, right? And you think, who could be in the woods or hiking Appalachia at any given time? You're like, okay, well, they're hikers, obviously. There's a park ranger, probably a PETA representative or an environmental rep, or something like that. I knew the setting was in Georgia, so I looked at kind of the map of where this happened, and I do some research about the town, stuff like that. And I'm like, okay, well, there's a school by here. Maybe 2 kids ditch school during the day and they go out because it might be fun to have kids in peril versus a bear on cocaine. And then you have the mother who's looking for them because she found out that they ditched school. And then obviously you have the people looking for the cocaine, which are the drug dealers. And then you have the people looking for the drug dealers, who are the cops. So I knew that it had to be an ensemble based on all of those characters. My inspiration for it was, it's a mad, 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 mad world.
I love that film.
Which is one of my favorite setups of all time. Motorists on a road, a guy crashes, before he dies, he says that there's a bunch of money under the big W, and everybody kind of goes on, a wild race to get there. I mean, Rat Race obviously was made more recently with the same setup, some sort of remake.
I used to watch that so often as a kid. It would be like a Friday night movie, like it was on like television. Like, now Criterion put out a great Blu-ray set for it. So you could see it there. I mean, it's very long. It's like 3 hours, right?
And
I think it had an intermission when it played too.
Oh, did it? I didn't know that.
I think it's so darn long that like they had one. That's
I know that it was 2 VHSs when I watched it when I was a kid. Instead of a bag of money, we have a bunch of cocaine. right? And then you have all of these people going after the coke or in the same setting, and you have these interweaving plots and storylines, and then you throw the bear in the middle of it. So then you make it a monster movie.
And the interesting thing is there's actually a lot of people in the movie that have no idea about the coke and no idea about the bear even, and they're just getting caught in the middle of it too. So that makes sense. So you get that 90 pages done. It took you 2 months. You then went through how many drafts before you started taking it out? Just tell us about the process of setting it up once it was a script.
It was crazy. I mean, it was really fast. It's an embarrassment to me because the script that I sent Brian, and Brian's the one that actually ended up sending it to Aditya at Lord Miller. They had a dinner and he was like, they want crazy ideas and stuff like that. And Brian was like, just so happened that I wrote this script called Cocaine Bear. And Brian didn't tell me that he was sending it to Aditya. As I said, he's my first read. He's not going to knock me on spelling errors or that kind of thing. So I had a whole bunch of errors and then also like character name continuity issues and all this stuff. And he told me that he sent it to Lord Miller. And I was like, what the hell? I need to proofread this thing. So he sent it to them and, they just set up their deal with Universal on the feature side and they took it in as their first movie. And I was like, are you sure you guys want to do this? Actually, I didn't say that, obviously. I was like, yes,
no, I know.
I can't believe it. And they did it. And, I wrote the script and I finished it on a Friday or a Monday or something like that, sent it to Brian. And it feels like within like weeks, we were already negotiating.
He didn't even try and have you just do a polished draft and then he took it out like that.
He had, one specific story note.
Oh, we'll get to that in the spoilers section.
Yeah, I changed that. And it was like literally the first shot of the movie. I changed that, but I'm not sure that he was really seeing any of the spelling errors or grammatical mistakes or anything like that.
Well, I just want to say, because people waste a lot of time on social media. I know I could end the sentence there. People waste a lot of time on social media, but people waste a lot of time on social media debating which words to use in a screenplay and which words you shouldn't use. Like I've seen people literally debate for multiple days about whether or not you should ever write "we see." Like we, the audience, see on a page.
Yeah.
Who cares? Like you prove that it's the concept, the characters, the story. If your readers are engaged enough, they're not really paying attention to spelling errors or a character continuity error. I've read Tarantino early drafts, and everybody has that have little tiny errors in them, and no one's taking points off of his grade. This isn't being graded. It's the first document, the first step towards a film. So, I mean, it's good.
I will say that
this sold like that because it proves that these long, tedious, stupid debates online, yes, you shouldn't be a total donkey on every single page, but as long as you're telling an engaging story with engaging characters, that's all people want to see.
Exactly. Yeah. I think it's all about the read. A spec is a sales document. My goal is always to make sure that the reader is having as much fun as you want the audience to have. I have trouble reading as it is, just growing up with whatever weird undiagnosed disabilities or whatnot. I just know that when something is clear and easy to read and fun, you get through it way faster. I mean, we've all spent time, 3 hours reading a script, and then sometimes it feels like it takes you 45 minutes. That's what I always strive to do, is have them sit down and read it, in one sitting. And if they can do that, then I think that you're doing a pretty good job. I will say though that you need to trust the writer as a producer or an executive. So I think that, mitigating those mistakes is definitely important, especially when you're in the first 20 pages. If somebody reads a couple errors in your first page, then it's okay, then the writer didn't even read that. Proofreading is different. But you're right about the whole slug line, we see, debate, that kind of stuff. There was stuff in the script that was put in there I never even intended anyone to shoot. I would go overboard in a scene and do something absolutely insane. And we could probably get into it in the spoiler section. And then I would just strike out the lines, be like, no, that's too much. It was I was self-editing in the read, and readers chuckled, I think.
I want to get into the spoilers so we could discuss all these details. The last non-spoiler question is, what was the budget and schedule?
Schedule was 40 some days and budget was around 30. I think.
Okay, that's great. Well, so podcast listeners and iTunes and Spotify and the watchers of the YouTube page for Backstory Magazine, which is where all these Zoomcasts go, you could watch us talk right now. We are going to get into the spoilers. So if you have not yet seen Cocaine Bear, press pause, mask up safely, go see it in theaters, bring your friends and family, and there you have it. You have been warned. We are getting into the spoilers. Okay, so right off the bat, I just want to ask, as an executive, because you have that experience reading scripts, and there's a lot of writers who have been successful that started off as readers in development as well. What were some of the things that were important to you about making your read entertaining? I mean, a lot of people have talked and debated, and I think rightfully so, about the importance of having a good opening hook of some sort. So like a good first 5 to 10 pages that gives the reader a reason to keep flipping the pages. What was important to you?
Yeah, I think, starting out working at a talent agency, like hundreds of scripts pass your desk like every week, and you're telling actors or writers for rewrites or directors to consider it, like what's going to make it pop, what's going to make them pay attention. And you're right, it is always that first, 5 to 10 pages, but it's also the idea, like make an elevator pitch. And that's what the log line is. I think that those are very important. With Cocaine Bear, we were so lucky that the name is also the log line.
Right.
Specifically with Cocaine Bear, if we're getting into the spoiler section, the opening scene used to be the kids doing cocaine in the woods. Like that's how the spec was written initially. Like those were the first scenes that I wrote. Dee Dee and Henry were the first two characters that I wrote. And then the one-upsmanship of like, I've done cocaine, no, you haven't. Okay, you try it. Like that whole thing, I thought was a very interesting and splashy opening to the movie. And again, there's a difference between the shooting script and the spec, because the spec is a sales document, as I said. Like you're getting somebody to buy in. And I thought that if they read two kids doing cocaine in the woods, if you got past those first 5 to 10 pages, then you're probably in for the entire movie. And there's not much violence in that first 5 to 10 pages. And then we just nail you with, some horrific gore for the rest of the movie.
Well, you said Duffield had a note for you that he wanted you to change before he sent it off to Lord Miller. What was his note?
It was a good note, but it was a stupid thing that I had in the script where it was like the first shot was actually Henry was taking a shit in the woods. And, I think that's so Brian, because he's like, yeah, take this person's head off here, doing coke off of the leg that falls down from the tree. That's all fine. But like a kid taking a shit is probably one step too far. But it did kind of solidify the innocence of that first scene, which was his point.
It's totally innocent and beautiful to see two middle school kids do cocaine in the woods. I mean, it's America. It's Norman Rockwell in the woods. I mean, what can we say? When was the scene added with the guy jumping out of the plane and bonking his head? Even though he had a faulty chute, like, him bonking his head and dying that way is funny too. When was that added?
Yeah, that was a Liz ad. I totally agree with that change. And also like changing it just to a classic linear story. And that is splashy, I think, theatrically. When you're watching the movie, that's a great opening scene. I think that for the read, I really needed to establish the tone and the way that the characters talk to each other, and that it's sweet and it's well written. And, these characters are distinct and they have personality, and it's not just like action right off the bat. When you're shooting the movie and you see the movie, it's funny and you can tell that these characters are sweet, but it's a little harder for me to articulate on the page when you just start with, a plane crash. But I think in the film, it's better that way.
That makes sense. I mean, tell us about the development process for a second. You were just talking about Elizabeth Banks giving you some notes, the film's director, and kind of having that scene start off the movie. What were any of the notes from Lord Miller? What were the rewrites that you needed to do once the project was fast-tracked and sold to become an actual film? Or was there not a lot that you needed to do?
I mean, I don't want to toot my own horn, but there wasn't that much work to be done on the script. There's many like little things, or it's adjusting a certain character, or when we have the cast in line, it's kind of like making sure that everybody has their moment and that kind of thing. That's something that Liz definitely brought. It's like, if I'm going to cast this up in the way that we want to, so people take the movie seriously and get actors like Alden, O'Shea, and Margot and Jesse, like everybody kind of has to have their moment. And most of them did, but we solidified those in the development process. And something that I learned from Lord and Miller, they love kindness and love in their movies. So sometimes it was, let's just not make it mean-spirited. So anytime something kind of towed that line, I pulled it back And I made sure really to kind of nail in the writing, like that relationship between the mother-daughter and her friend and that kind of thing.
Yeah, you could say that really Ray Liotta's character was the only mean-spirited person in the movie. The teenage gang members were just a little out of control and wacky, but it seems like Ray Liotta was really the only baddie because even, as you were saying, like Ray's son Eddie and David, which is, O'Shea's character, like they were nice guys that were part of a crime organization, but they were always trying to be nice and respectful. So that's an interesting note of like trying to make the characters somebody worth investing time and energy into.
It's not mean humor, and that's something that I've taken from them and I now kind of have adopted in everything that I write. But of course you need stakes, right? Yeah. You have to have a big bad. And I think that Ray's character is the big bad in the movie. And I think that the trick with O'Shea and Alden was like, create a buddy comedy, but they're also drug dealers. And the trick with that was like, how do you care about drug dealers? And it's really just through their relationship.
How long would you say that development process was? And like, did it go through another full draft at that time?
Yeah, I mean, we were throwing drafts back and forth throughout the beginning of COVID a bunch. Okay. But, the heart of the script, the structure, except for kind of switching those early 20 pages like we already spoke about, all that stuff largely remained the same. They have such a great collaborative mentality. They're like, there are no bad ideas. And also, let's just continue to push the envelope. It's like, that's great, but what is really great? What about this? What about that? And, that's what I love about working with them.
How many months would you say it was developed before like you were locked and then starting to look at it as a movie?
Well, it felt like we were on the fast track for a little while and then COVID happened. So we were also provided with an extra, couple months to really do that stress test on the script. So from beginning to end, I mean, it was like the end of 2019 is when like all the deals were done and that kind of thing. COVID hits and then we're, not in production until 2021.
Okay. That makes sense. I mean, I'm curious about rules because, well, I mean, first off, I have a past of hiking, and it was funny to me in the movie that everybody keeps giving differing opinions of what you're supposed to do when you see a bear. I was hiking in Montana as a teen randomly with a group of people, and this bear started tracking us. And we had this debate of like, what are we supposed to do? And they're like, you just got to make noise. Like bears are big and scary looking, but the more noise you make, they'll run away. Like it's kind of what people say in LA about coyotes if you encounter one when you're walking your dog. And so like we were just like banging on our like pans and our plates, and like the bear like growled or something because it was like just walking parallel to us a little up on a hill, and it was just freaky. And then like we realized it was a cub and there was a mama bear nearby, and we're like, we're so dead. And like we just made enough noise that like the cub just wasn't interested in being around us anymore, and luckily nothing happened. But they say don't move, but they also say run in the movie. From your research, what is the advice that you're supposed to do if you encounter a bear?
I think it's, if it's black, fight back. If it's brown, lie down. That's the kind of what we were going off of. That's pretty much the extent of my research.
What were the rules that you had for who lives and who dies? I mean, like, so, Margot, her character is the forest ranger. She was fantastic. I mean, she's always great. And like, I would say out of all the deaths, she rates pretty high for like the most gruesome. I mean, she is like literally dragged face down in a stretcher behind an ambulance. When did you decide who was going to live and die? Because essentially on your kindness scale, there was nothing mean or unkind about her or the other ranger or the EMTs. But, people do need to die in this movie in gory ways because I know you're a fan of gore horror movies. So when did you decide who was going to live and who was going to die?
Yeah, I think that if you take like the classic horror structure of like, it's the people having sex at the beginning of the movie and you're like, oh, they're definitely going to die because they committed this sin. That's more of like the dramatic horror trope, but this is horror comedy. So I think in horror comedy, the people just need to be vaguely annoying or idiotic, or annoying to other characters, where it's like you cross that line and you make it so horrific that you can't help but laugh. So for me, the rules were you have to establish that main ensemble and you have to like them because you have to care about when they are in danger or in peril. And also in, one person's story end up dying, you're going to have to make that, somewhat emotional. So you have to care about those characters. For the collateral deaths, which I guess we could call them more of the comedic deaths, again, I think that you can kill characters in horror comedy who are just annoying, and not annoying to the audience, but just like idiotic. It's like Margot shoots some guy in the head. And, after she's been toting this pistol around, she ran away from the environmental rep and a little kid in a tree when she was supposed to, probably be protecting them with that pistol. At that point, you're kind of like, okay, she can die. And then you want to push it over the edge too, because she needs a great death. It's like you have Margot Martindale there.
Right.
What's the craziest thing that you can do? Yeah, that idea of the gurney flipping over and her face dragging against the gravel came fairly early on. I needed that ambulance sequence to be so insane that you couldn't cut it, right? You can't cut it out of the movie. You couldn't cut it out of the script. Some would say that, like, I guess typical screenwriting books and, like Robert McKee and Sid Field, there has to be a reason that you're watching what you're watching. And that ambulance chase, there's not a single lead character in it. They're all the peripheral characters. You just met these two paramedics, but I guess the lead character is the bear, right? You need to give the audience what they want. You have to feed the audience.
And feed the bear.
I was like, let me just go over the top. And it's like that scene could have ended 3 pages earlier, but it's like, let's continue to push it.
It was a great scene. And I've always been a fan of the actor, who is hanging out the back door of the ambulance. He's great.
Yeah, Scott. Yeah.
Scott. That's right. I mean, it was great to see Scott on the big screen, and like it was a cool role for him. And you were on the page, like you're having a bear run and chase and leap into the open back door of an ambulance. So I mean, like you're giving people these crazy action scenes that you would not think that that's where it's going to go. Like a scene where, again, the kids are like climbing the tree because they think they're safe, and the environmental guy's like, what are you talking about? Bears could climb tree. And then you just see the bear hustling up the tree, and it was just absolutely hilarious that the bear then decides to leave Henry, the little kid, alone and go after the environmental guy because some cocaine had accidentally gotten on his clothing. That was like, again, like another absolutely hilarious scene. And you said Margot shoots one of the kids, and she doesn't do it out of spite. She does it completely by accident. She was aiming for the bear, and she's just a bad shot. So I mean, I love the EMT sequence. I thought that was like just fun because that there are people that are expendable, in horror terms, and you're going to see them expended. And that was a lot of fun. Ooh, hey, I'm jumping in really quick to remind you to check out Backstory Magazine over at backstory.net. Of course, I also hope you check out today's sponsor, screencraft.org. But a quick thing about Backstory, if you've never read us before, you could test drive us on a desktop or laptop by reading our free issue over at backstory.net or via our iPad app, Backstory. And folks, our Oscar issue is live. That's right, our 10th annual Oscar issue is live. But if you want to become a subscriber and support independent film journalism, and I know you do, you could use discount coupon code SAVE5. That will save you $5 off a 1-year subscription. But look, it would really mean a lot to me to have my podcast listeners and iTunes and Spotify and my YouTube watchers of the Backstory Magazine YouTube page support my passion project. So thanks for considering becoming a subscriber. And folks, I hope you also check out today's sponsor, screencraft.org. Screencraft has years of experience of putting together writers with agents and managers to launch their careers, and is a great resource for learning more about your craft through screenwriting lectures and entering genre-specific screenwriting contests. Screencraft winners and finalists throughout the years have gone on to write films and TV for Netflix, Amazon, Apple TV, Universal, Blumhouse, Lionsgate, Hulu, ABC, and more. So I hope you'll check out screencraft.org to learn all about it. But now let's jump right back into our conversation with screenwriter Jimmy Warden about his latest film, Cocaine Bear. I'm kind of curious what, if anything, just because we had brought him up earlier, Ray Liotta, the big baddie of the movie, this is like one of his last movies. He sadly passed away. Did you get to spend any time with him? I've just always been a fan of his work. It's so great that he's in this, your first film. I mean, that's just awesome. Was there any rewriting you got to do for him or discuss his character together, or was that not something that happened?
I think as the story goes, he was like, of course I'm going to do a movie called Cocaine Bear. He said that to Liz, and they had a relationship previously. And when she told me that he had signed on and agreed to do it, I turned into a puddle. I was like, this is the best moment of my life.
That's awesome.
And watching him come on set and the energy that he had, he was prepared and he was so professional. everything that he brought to the table was contagious, and the whole cast and crew was sort of giddy from the onset. Working with him, I just feel like extremely lucky to be, a small part of something in his work. Yeah.
Well, so were you on set the whole time? How much time did you get to spend on set?
Yeah, I was there the whole time. And I know that is pretty rare for a screenwriter. So I felt lucky about that too. Again, great leadership between the people at Lord Miller and then also Elizabeth to allow that to happen, because it was a great experience for me.
Yeah, and they're all fans of writers, and it's smart to have writers on set. So when you're on set, aside from just going to craft service, was there anything that like suddenly everybody looked to you and you needed to do a quick run back to a trailer and then write up a scene, because they realized that they needed something rewritten or something created?
Yeah, I think that there was like one scene where Stash and David and Eddie are walking throughout the woods, and he's giving his lizard story and the conversation topics monologue while David is kind of like, what the hell is this guy talking about? And Eddie is crying over it because he thinks it's the sweetest thing he's ever heard. That was the type of thing where it was like, okay, we actually only have a finite amount of time to shoot this. So how do we consolidate it down? And how do we get it only in like 2 setups rather than getting it in 6 or 7? So it's that type of rewriting. But again, I'll say that we shot the blue draft of this script, which is something that is kind of unheard of. And for the listeners who don't know, that's the second production draft. So that's like one revision after you start production. Goes white and then blue. Again, we had the benefit of COVID and all getting along and spending a lot of time together and, brainstorming the stuff and prepping it, that we were able to just shoot the script at a certain point. So when you have a script that makes sense and it works, it also frees up the actors, do their own thing. And there's some great ad libs in this movie as well.
Yeah, I mean, with a cast like this, of course, there's going to be great improvs as well. So as an executive, it's important to note that you, again, were saying earlier that sometimes it's difficult to get lost in a script. And one of the things, and this is terrible, but one of the things that often executives complain about is there's too much action setup or too much writing, describing things, too much description. But things need description. Action is not through dialogue. It has to be described. A lot of writers I've interviewed have, kind of found a haiku way to do it, in which they put a lot of white space on the page so it doesn't seem too cluttered. They try and make sure that there's not big paragraphs. You have a lot of things to describe, especially like what's happening in the EMT scene, because so much of it is just big action. What were some of the tips and tricks that you learned for making the action digestible beyond just how crazy and entertaining it is that there's a coked up bear chasing everybody around?
I definitely do follow that rule of like white space, especially when it comes to action. When you're describing the setting for a scene or something like that, you have to make sure that the audience is catching everything, especially in an action sequence, or the reader is catching everything when they're reading an action sequence. And the stuff that you really need them to catch, you need that to pop out. And it's all about setting up tension as well. So like if you hit return on final draft, that is essentially an ellipses, and then you underline something, or you put an exclamation point, like all of this stuff implies certain feeling. I definitely think about that a lot, and I'm not consistent with it through scripts. Like some scripts that I have are very bulky, not as much white space. I actually have kind of since stopped putting as much white space in things, but I've tried to be more concise with the way that I set up a scene. I was very specific about certain things, but when I know that I want like one character to kind of have like a puby mustache when we're talking about the 3 kids in the woods going around stabbing people, one to have a ponytail or, a mullet sort of thing, and then to have a vest on that's like very 80s, then that's just what I ended up calling the characters. So I called them Stash, Vest, and Ponytail.
Yeah.
So it's like figuring out ways. And also I think that that's, it's not the best thing about the script. It's not anything that anybody's really going to see. You don't know those characters' names in the movie even, but it does give them something identifiable when you're reading it. It's different than calling characters Dan, Bob, and Eddie. That's the same name to me, right?
Yeah. No, I mean, like, and that's good, like to do that too and to never name them. So, I mean, like, I kind of do like that. Tell us about left turns. It's always interesting to hear about when you were first starting out. What was something that maybe ended up on the page for a while that you cut out? Like it didn't even make it to the draft that Brian Duffield read? What was something that was originally for an hour, a minute, a week, whatever, it was going to be a part of this movie, and then you decided, nah, I'm going to skip it?
There was, I don't know if you're familiar with the Alan Jackson song Chattahoochee, but it's a song from the 80s, and the music video is insane. He's like wearing jeans in the river. So there was a scene once upon a time, there was the set of shooting the music video, and the bear attacks the people shooting the video. It was weird. It was like a music video inside the movie of Chattahoochee, but it was in the middle of the song, the bear tears Alan Jackson to shreds.
That's hilarious. That's crazy. I could see how that ended up getting knocked out. Was there anything else like that? But even though I love that.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there's some things that I did in this script a couple times, and I've done it in subsequent scripts too, just to make sure the audience is still, like, the heart is still pounding and they're still smiling throughout a more intense sequence or something like that. It's like give them a palate cleanse. I would do this thing where I would write a scene that kind of went over the top. So, for example, after David beats the crap out of the Duchamps in the bathroom, I wrote that he covers them in kerosene and then lights a match and walks out and the bathroom explodes. And then I would just highlight that and click strike through. And it would strike through the whole thing. And then Eddie walks into the bathroom and you continue the scene. So I would just do things like that. And like maybe it's kitschy and lame to some people, but it kept me entertained. And I think that, some people chuckled at it. In a subsequent script that Brian also produced called Borderline, which I directed and I shot last year, there was a scene that I crossed out because I thought it was too insane. And then Brian was like, no, you can't cross that out. That's great. And it's also plausible that it would happen in this moment. And, we shot it, and it's like probably one of the best scenes in the movie.
When is that coming out, by the way?
There's no release date. We're actually finishing it now. We're in Indy, so we don't have a home. We haven't tried to sell it yet.
Okay, well, we'll have to have you back to discuss it. But so are you saying that like in the draft, again, that Brian sent to Lord Miller, there were these strike through things in the screenplay that were just on the page with strike throughs, which is, for our listeners, lines through it so you could still see the text, but it's to be quote unquote erased.
Yeah. Sometimes for like lame jokes or puns that I would just put in, description, I would strike that and say like, I'm so sorry for writing that. Like that's kind of thing. Like
that's really funny. And it's strange that you would do that because you're kind of showing this content that you don't want to be in the movie as like a nod to the reader. I could see this concept of a strike through element on a page being something that would be hotly debated on social media. But I got to say, I've never seen somebody send out a script that has a strike through element in it as a kind of joke, like lighting the bathroom on fire or a pun or something like that they later cut out. That's really fascinating. I kind of like that you did that. If anybody else goes out there and does that, it would look a little too gimmicky, but like the fact that you kind of did it first and it worked for this, that's actually really cool.
And I'm honestly not sure what anybody really thought of it. It's just something that also entertained me. This was a sales document for sure, a spec script is, but a lot of it's selling yourself.
And you were just trying to crack the reader up.
Right. I was trying to put my personality on the page a little bit.
Were there any limitations? Was there anything that you wanted the bear to do that you either couldn't afford or was too complicated? Because from anything I've read, it seems like the bear was mostly CG with, probably some motion capture in there, I would guess for sure. And there wasn't like a physical furry.
We had a bear performer, a guy named Alan Henry, that would kind of show up with this fake bear snout, and he would walk on these like two black crutches on his arms and kind of just like waddle in so the actors can kind of sense that a bear was behind him. The guy's giant. He wore spandex. He was phenomenal.
It's like he was in a green screen suit or whatever.
No, it was just black. It was like purely for reference, for some size reference, and also like for the scene where Eddie is bear hugged by the bear and they're like dancing together. Alan like actually did that to him and like lifted him up and that kind of thing. But yeah, the bear is all CG. That's all Weta and Liz for working so hard on doing that.
Was there anything that you wanted to do that you couldn't afford?
The limitations were just that at a certain point, you can't hit the audience with the same emotional task, scene after scene. You can't just have the bear attack and kill people over and over again and in back-to-back scenes, but also you have to keep the peril and intensity level very high. So that gazebo scene, for example, where the detective Bob, played by Isaiah, standing on top of the gazebo and they're in that standoff with David and Eddie and Stash, we had to have that tension, and also they can't move. They have guns pointed at each other. But in the previous scene, we just had the ambulance chase where you've given the audience like a pretty hefty dose of adrenaline, and you've just killed 5 characters basically within, 20 minutes. And I didn't want to do that again. The bear just can't arrive at the gazebo and tear everybody to shreds. So it was like, what could it do other than that? That was more just trying to create these relationships and different scenarios that weren't just revolving around the bear attacking and killing people. And that's why I inserted characters like, the 3 idiots that are roaming around the mountain stabbing people, and why I wanted to, really have that tension build between Bob and Sid for that final standoff. The bear doesn't kill everybody who dies in this movie. Andrew Carter Thornton dies on his own accord. Margot Martindale shoots that poor kid in the head, and Ray Liotta shoots Isaiah in the stomach. That to me was the trick in telling the story, is like, how do you continue the tension and the peril and the stakes, but not have it only revolve around the bear doing cocaine.
Look, I hope Isaiah lives. Maybe he just is, unconscious. That's where it is in my head. Well, so look, editing is the last stage of storytelling. What did you learn about your script and editing? What was cut out that you miss, or was maybe a good lesson, like something that you realized in editing you didn't need?
Yeah, I think a lot of that's setup. You forget how much an actor brings to something purely by being great. So there's probably some pieces of dialogue or maybe even full scenes that are on the cutting room floor that you didn't need once you got to know the characters. And, once Alden says one line, you get his entire personality and everything that he's been through. He's crying over a plate of pasta, talking about his, his dead wife, and he got a tattoo that was spelled wrong. Her name is Joan, but the guy wrote John. You don't need another scene after that, So we were talking about being concise in character description or scene description, but it's also trying to be concise in setup. And sometimes 2 scenes can become one. And that's something that you can't really learn until you see it on the edited room floor, because you're like, you don't need it. I mean, the movie makes sense.
Was there anything special effects wise with the bear that was cut out that was just too much or too crazy and they needed to drop it, even though the effects were on their way to be rendered, I would guess?
Not to my knowledge, but That might be a Liz Banks question. I think that, there are always going to be conversations about gore level and stuff like that, but I think we went pretty gory.
Yeah.
There's no big scene that we cut with the bear. Okay. Every scene that we shot with the bear is still in the movie.
That's refreshing to know. Well, I mean, this could have ended a bunch of different ways. And I like the way that you chose, in which, Carrie Russell, the mama bear, finally finds her daughter, and she and Henry are there. And then, Ray Liotta and his son Eddie and David are there, and the bear family is there. We see some little cubs who are now addicted to cocaine as well. And it was a funny standoff. And it looks like maybe the mama bear is going to die, but really the only person that dies is Ray Liotta, and the rest of them live. What were the different permutations that you played with for that ending? Did all the people that live ended up living, or were there other people that died? Tell us about finding that ending and bringing it home.
Originally, David also died. Sid shoots him, and that wound in the neck actually causes him to die. And now in talking about it, I'm like, it's a no-brainer that we change that. The movie wants to have the happy ending. I, like you, I hope that Bob is still alive somewhere. But, I wanted to give the weird Hollywood ending to a lot of these storylines. Like, everybody ended up being safe. And like you said, who became addicted to cocaine? Who died in the end? Who is the real villain? All of this stuff happened not because of the bear. The cocaine literally fell out of the clear blue sky into its lap, and it did it. It's not really its fault. So I also want audiences, not right after watching the movie, but maybe when you wake up the next morning and you're like, okay, maybe this was a subtle allegory for the war on drugs, or, drug use in general. All that stuff, I think, plays into who lives and who dies. The first decision I ever made after being like, okay, I actually want this to be a bear rampaging through the woods and killing people, I said, I don't want this bear to die. I want it to live on, and not for a money grab because I want extra sequels, but because I think that this was a redemption story that the bear deserved in the end. And it didn't get because it was unlucky. because the true story is sad, and I didn't want to make a sad story. You could kill everybody, but you couldn't kill the bear. I think
I agree.
You would lose the audience.
Well, and the other character you couldn't kill was Reba, the dog, who was liberated from the car one way or another and has a new home.
Yeah.
And maybe Bob will come get her if Bob's still alive. What was your toughest scene? What was the scene that you kept coming back to and writing over and over? And how did you creatively rise to that challenge?
Yeah, the scene for me was the end, that third act. You want to have the audience raise their fists in the air and say, hell yeah, and we really needed that. So we put our heads together and, we came up with this sort of Popeye ending where a brick of Coke falls out of the duffel, smashes on a rock, bursts open and falls into Cookie's snout. And then she's revived like Popeye and, kills the big bad in the end. And it totally makes her the hero. Again, trying to subvert some expectations. But I watched it with a crowd full of people yesterday and they cheered in that moment when she roars and has a whole duffel bag of cocaine that she's going to share with her cubs. So it's like really creating that moment of victory in the end to cause the audience to laugh and cheer. They're rooting for the thing that has just killed so many people.
Was that the name on the page for the bear, Cokie? Like
Smokey? Cokie, yeah.
So it's your version of Smokey.
The bear.
I like it. Well, so look, in the end of the movie, we hear a little bit of a roar. We know that the bear is still alive. We know the cubs are alive, and people have been already speculating if there could be a sequel. I'm reading from today's Variety, and actor Jesse Taylor Ferguson told Variety, he plays the environmental ranger, I think the sequel could be called Adderall Alligator. It's a very excited alligator and it cleans things. It's a very efficient alligator. Co-producer Christopher Miller says that he thinks a sequel could possibly be Cocaine Bear versus Cocaine Shark. And he said they'll be in shallow water, like on a sandbar, and that he would watch that. And then Aaron Holiday, who plays, I believe, Stash, said Cocaine Rats versus people in New York because there's more rats than people in New York. There's a lot of possibilities here. What, if anything, have you thought about for a sequel? Could there be a sequel? Is this something that you want to continue doing? Because I think crowds are going to demand it of you, sir.
Well, that's very kind. Yeah, I mean, those are all hilarious ideas. I'm still in Cocaine Bear territory. I think there's still story to be told with Cokie herself. And what I loved about the original story, the true story, is that it actually happened. Like how plausible that is that the bear got into all of this cocaine. And I think that the trick for the sequel is to kind of recreate that in some way that's also surprising. So I would still love to tell the sequel to Cocaine Bear, and then the offshoots can be left up to the internet. I mean, I'm happy to write them, but and have some fun with them. But my priorities still lie with Cokie, my favorite character.
Well, my 76-year-old mom has seen the trailer. She enjoyed it. So I think she's going to see the movie. So hopefully you'll get that sequel money. But without a doubt, Jimmy, you have been very generous with your time. And I thank you so much for talking us through the trials and tribulations of Cocaine Bear. And I can't wait to see what you do next, man.
Yeah, thanks so much. And as I said, you do great work. You're very helpful to screenwriters and everybody. So,
well, thanks a lot. And in your article for Backstory Magazine, hopefully we'll have some of those pages with strikeouts. And we will also be adding Brian Duffield to the Backstory Magazine article on Cocaine Bear. So the readers of Backstory have that to look forward to as well.
Perfect. I look forward to seeing it. Thanks so much.
And that's how the Q&A went down. Special thanks again to screenwriter Jimmy Warden for being so generous with his time and coming down to chat about his latest film, Cocaine Bear. And folks, I hope you also check out today's sponsor, screencraft.org. And while you're surfing around online, I hope you also check out Backstory Magazine over at backstory.net. You could read us on a desktop or laptop or via our iPad app, Backstory. If you've never read us before, you could test drive us. And our Oscar issue just came out, so you've got to check that out because it's full of scripts and interviews that we know that you will love. And if you want to save $5 off a one-year subscription, just use coupon code SAVE5. That's SAVE and the number 5, and that will save you $5 off a one-year subscription to Backstory Magazine. So look, it would really mean a lot to me to have my podcast listeners and iTunes and Spotify and my YouTube watchers of the Backstory Magazine YouTube page, which is where you could see these Zoom casts and see the screenwriters speak. It would really mean a lot to me to have you support my passion project. So thanks for considering becoming a subscriber. The Q&A with Jeff Goldsmith podcast is a copyright of Unlikely Films Incorporated in 2023. All rights reserved. And folks, if you want to get a hold of me, you could find me as Yo Goldsmith on Twitter or backstory_mag on Twitter. Those same handles work for Instagram, Yo Goldsmith on Instagram or backstory_mag on Instagram. You could also check out my Facebook fan page and I'll respond to you there as well. Or you could be old fashioned and write an email to backstoryletters@gmail.com and I'll get back to you as soon as I can there as well. I'm Jeff Goldsmith, the publisher of Backstory Magazine and the host of the Q&A. Thanking you for tuning in and telling you to stay out of trouble. Till next week.